So today, together, we'll explore in 3 modules. First of all, um, looking at conflict as simply as possible, figuring out how to make it a simple concept, because simple helps deal with complexity. And then we'll look at what I consider to be the 8 relatively simple steps to help you prepare for your own negotiations. And then we'll look at where and how to get some help for this particular set of tools. And so let's begin. First of all, conflict is inevitable and everywhere. That just stands to reason, because we're always negotiating. And if we're in business, we're negotiating. With family, we're negotiating. With our friends, we're often negotiating. And most of those negotiations don't spiral into conflict, thankfully. But when they do, the question becomes, what do we do about it to prevent it from impacting our success and satisfaction in life? And it certainly takes some courage and some diligence to look at your own contribution to conflict, but it is a crucial part of preparing for reaching resolutions. So I recently helped a family involved in a dispute over their mother's estate. The adult siblings were arguing over whether or not their mother had the mental competence to make the changes that she had apparently made in her will. Now, the estate lawyer and accountant invited me in to work with the family quite early in the process. And together with their assistants, we were able to talk with them about how litigation and fighting was going to damage not only the value of the estate, but the very important family relationships that had built up over the years. Thankfully, as a result of that intervention, the parties were able to shift how they negotiated with each other and commit to continuing those negotiations in the future as they dealt with their mother and with the estate. And so it was an early and effective preparation for their negotiations that made the difference there. And as a consequence, makes the difference for all of us if we prepare for our negotiations. And as a general rule of thumb, I think it makes sense, again, keeping things simple, to consider that if you've got a difficult conversation, a difficult negotiation coming at you, you want to prepare about twice as long as the negotiation itself might take. So if you've got a day of negotiation or an hour of negotiation, prepare for that appropriately by about doubling the time in your preparation. And we'll look at how to do that as we move forward. So to begin, let's just try, as I said, this is about making conflict as simple as possible to deal with. And I acknowledge that once you're into it, it seldom feels or experiences like it's simple. But having a simple context to deal with conflict can be very helpful. So at its simplest, conflict occurs when someone does something or fails to do something that blocks our access to what is important to us. And we believe that this should not be that way, and we can react often emotionally. And that emotion can trigger our way of thinking about the conflict. And so I'm trying to unpack that and make it as simple as possible. Let me give you a very simple example of how quickly emotion and conflict can be triggered. Imagine the final moments of a championship minor hockey game. The kids have played their hearts out. It's late stages in the game, and they're locked in a tie. The stands are filled with family and friends. Unfortunately, the referee misses a close call at the blue line, and one team scores to win the game. Instantly, half the fans are outraged, and half are ecstatic. Now, if the next day you had a meeting with people from each side of that equation, you would likely hear very, very different stories about what happened and what they made it mean. And hopefully in that situation, it doesn't involve the parents, the dads fighting in the parking lot after the game, but it could. It's how quickly emotions can trigger conflict. So that brings me to what I want to share with you as part of keeping conflict simple. And that's the nature of conflict. And it's not, it's intended simply as a way of thinking about conflict as it occurs in our lives. And the first thing I want to say about it is that it's born in the past, because the game was yesterday. And the events are always in the past. The other party's reaction to us, the things that triggered our emotions, are all in the past. And of course, we're always present in the present moment. We can never be other than the present moment. So as a consequence, conflict exists in the present moment because we bring it here. And if we then go the next step and project it into our future, we can make our future about conflict. We can hire lawyers, we can take all sorts of action, we can give up and withdraw, or we can have family conflicts. Our future becomes about the conflict and not about the solution that would work for the parties. So the negotiation is a critical piece. Let's unpack that a bit further and look at conflict in the past. So I invite you to think about where a conflict isn't in the past. The event itself has to be, of course, in the past. And we bring it into the present moment and deal with it. So the conflict exists because our focus is on the past and the story that we create about what happened to us and what we made it mean. And when we share that story, with others to enroll them in how right we are, the story takes on a life of its own. And the conflict, we become trapped in our conflict stories. Our focus tends to be about the past and fault and blame, and our conversations are about the past and fault and blame. And as a consequence, the future is at risk of becoming about the past and fault and blame. And so the question becomes, since we're always in the present moment, our future always exists in the present moment as a possibility that we create by our choices and by the commitments that we make to a path forward, by the commitments that we make to the milestones that are necessary to create that future. If that's about conflict, then our lives can start to experience the various things I said at the start of my talk that I've observed as a mediator over the 30 years that I've been involved with this type of work. So we want a future to be about the things that are important to us and not about our past and conflict. We want to be driving, looking forward, and not looking in the rearview mirror, as it were. Oops, jumped one, sorry. So I evolved something pretty simple here as far as the notion of keeping conflict simple. Conflict was born in the past. Conflict lives in the present moment, and conflict impacts the future. And the resolution formula is really very simple. It's the choice in the present moment to shift our focus from the past and fault and blame and the conflict and the drama that it created for us to the future and how we might share our stories, not for who's right or wrong, but for understanding. And based on that shared understanding, how do we co-create a future that works and meets the interests and needs of both parties? And I call that the resolution formula. Now, I talk about conflict being simple as a story. And if we can step back and look at our story and our own part in it, and our counterpart on the other side's part in it, we have a real chance to keep the conflict one step removed from our emotions, one step triggering the kind of drama that's got us trapped in the conflict. We're always going to have different stories and different meanings. We're always going to be different people. We have different backgrounds and cultures. We have different values. We negotiate differently. And so there are lots of complexities, but these complexities are themselves a story. We have a story about the complexities that keeps us focused on the complexities and not on making it simply about unpacking the story and managing the conflict in that fashion. And so I created the 8 steps to get ahead and stay ahead of conflict as a tool for people to use for their own negotiations so that they can get ahead and stay ahead of conflict. I recently had a direct experience of the complexity and not the simplicity of conflict. I was selling a 2003 Toyota Roadrunner, and the first person that came as a result of my Kijiji ad was of a culture that was had grown up, I'm sure, in bargaining. And so I found myself in a conversation about, not about the price, but about all the reasons that we were bargaining over that had nothing to do with the true value of the vehicle. And I forgot my complexity and found myself getting irritated. I forgot my simplicity, I should say, and found myself getting irritated. So the first question then becomes, in step one, is to recognize and accept as early as possible that you have a potential conflict. You've got negotiations, you're facing difficult conversations. What about them is making it difficult? What is it about this person or persons that we're negotiating with that I have a story about that makes it a challenge to deal with these people, and therefore I have a potential for conflict. And you want to recognize that as absolutely early as possible in the conversation, and consider what you're going to do with it. So stepping back from that identification, how do you prepare going forward? Step one, recognize that this particular set of conversations coming at you may have the potential for conflict. And step two, take a look at your own emotional commitment to this. Observe your emotions, but don't let them control you. Acknowledge them, but don't let them control you. You want to step back from your own story and look at what triggered you and what sent you there in the first place. So this is a self-analysis that begins by you recognizing that you're emotional about the conversation, the negotiation that you're about to have, and that you need to step back from those emotions and look at it as an objective and careful analysis of what's going on. So step three, here's where it gets a bit interesting. I want you to consider that you want to take the complexity and make it simple. You want to explore your own story and separate what happened, which is the facts, from what you made it mean. Now, over the years, it's been my experience that an awful lot of the conflict exists on the meaning side. Yes, there can be disputes over the facts, but ultimately the facts are capable of being determined. And indeed, if you end up in litigation, the focus of your legal counsel and ultimately is to have your version of the facts accepted by the judge. So the judge will ultimately, or the arbitrator will ultimately tell you what the facts are. But you can look at your own facts and separate them from the meanings, the interpretations, the judgments, and the assumptions that you make about what happened and what you make it mean. And there's a tool, a very simple tool to help you do that. So you can try this. Take a sheet of paper, write a line down the middle, and on the left-hand side, list the facts. And be honest with yourself and objective, and also list what is necessary to prove those facts in as much detail as you can think of. So what are the facts? And then on the right-hand side of the page, shift over and look at how you're interpreting, judging, and making assumptions about those facts and their impact based on your story of what happened to you. So you're separating your story from facts and meanings. And you want to be as honest with yourself and as meticulous as possible. And in fact, this is an excellent exercise for potential conflict. If you in the future retain a lawyer to help you, this kind of separation of fact and meaning is going to be very important to their ability to understand and support your particular claim. And it's certainly here where you can get some help from family and friends, and we'll talk about that in the future. It's really important to be honest with yourself about the facts and to also do your homework in clarifying how they get proved. I mediated a conflict between a lakeside community, cottages around the lake, and an oil and gas firm that wanted to drill underneath the lake, a directional drill underneath the lake to get at the resource. And part of the landowner's concern was that they were convinced that the company's seismic activity had caused a fish die-off in the lake and impacted their enjoyment of their property. In the process of setting up the mediation, we were able to have Alberta Environment do some research and determine that, in fact, the fish die-off had occurred 6 months before the seismic activity. Now, that was only one of a number of issues, so the mediation continued apace, but it was very important to have been able to establish that fact in an independent way by going to Alberta Environment. And it took it off the table and built some trust in the process. And so that was an example of doing the homework. Now, step 4, and this again is interesting, is I suggest that, again, in service of keeping it as simple as possible, you take a sheet of paper, write a line down the middle, and make your best guess as to how they see the facts. And on the right-hand side of the paper, their interpretations, judgments, and assumptions about those facts. You want to try to understand where their judgments and assumptions and interpretations are coming from. And this is, yes, this is a guess. And yes, it can be complex. And yes, this is where you begin to think about their natural style of negotiating. Are they hard-nosed? Are they willing to listen? A lot of the challenge in preparing for a negotiation is how to get the other party to the table to talk about what really needs to be talked about. And we all know, and when we think about our negotiations, we know people who make that very difficult. And I'm going to talk to you a bit more about how to invite them to participate in a negotiation that actually works. So you've got your own sheet of paper with your facts and your meanings, and you've got your best guess as to their facts and meanings, and you go to step 5. Now, step 5 is all about the analysis between those 2 pages, looking at what are the real discrepancies, the real conflict over fact. And what might I do if I'm doing my own preparation? What might I do to prove the facts in an independent way that isn't a debate over you're right, I'm wrong, back and forth, but is actually a useful exercise to prove the facts? And what might you do with the other side together to assess the proof of the facts in a kind of a collaborative mindset as opposed to a battle? You might retain, a simple example, retain an appraiser to give you a value of something so that you're not arguing over it. Or you might look at outside independent criteria, such as building codes, to determine the height of a foundation or a building, rather than fighting about it. And you want to consider these things and have them at hand as you proceed through to prepare for your negotiations. And you also want to think about what are the roadblocks and barriers, what are the issues and concerns that are most likely to get in the way of us having a conversation. And it is here that you can think about the natural style as you have experienced it so far with the person that you're about to embark in a negotiation. Now, step 6, and this is important. It's easy to skate over it, but it's very important. And it's about getting clear on what is really most important, identifying the interests and the needs and the concerns that guide and drive each party. And so what I recommend here that you do is think about if you were sitting a year in the future, looking back on what had happened, what has to have occurred, what has to have happened for you to be satisfied that your interests and your needs have been met. And do the same thing for the other side. Make a list of what you think has to have happened for them to be satisfied as to their interests and needs. And armed with that information, you are getting very well prepared for your own negotiations going forward. Now, step 7, and this is the getting the party to the table step. And what I have found works really well here, even if the relationship has become quite conflicted, you want to reach out to the other party with an invitation. You're inviting them, not demanding that they participate, but you're inviting them to engage in a negotiation about resolution, as opposed to fault and blame in the past and arguing over. You don't want to argue. And so the way to do that is to first of all, I think, share with them that you want to have a dialogue about resolution that works for both sides rather than a debate about right and wrong. Share your preparation. Tell them about steps 1 through 6. Just say, here's what I have done. Here's what I've gleaned from my own thinking about your perspective and your position and what's important to you. And let me know if I've managed to hit on any points that are important to you. And let's talk about that. I'd really like to explore and find out more about how this is impacting you. And I want to share with you how it's impacting me. And that kind of conversation has been highly effective in many of the conflict coaching situations that I have assisted people with. It just shifts the conversation. Now, there are unfortunately people out there who will not play. And that's why lawyers are never going to be out of business, and we're not going to shut the courts down despite what COVID is doing to it. In fact, many of the legal counsel that I have been talking with over this mess have reported a tidal wave of litigation already beginning to happen post-COVID. And so I think that our challenges for conflict are going to increase, and perhaps these steps will be a much better way to deal with them, certainly in your own life, to have your experience of life work much better for you. So finally, step 8 is the actual meeting itself. And again, the intention for the meeting is critical. The first intention is that it is a dialogue about future solutions rather than a debate about right and wrong from the past. It is about keeping your story as simple and one step removed from you as possible so that your emotions are not triggered. It's very likely to have times when either you or the other party has snapped back. Something has triggered, and you're back in your story of why that's not fair, why that was bad. You're back in the story of the past. And you might need to take a break. You might need to remind yourself that the solution has to be created in the future. It has to be a commitment to move forward, to share stories based on understanding, share a future path that works for both of you or all of you, depending on the numbers. And so it is about a dialogue and not a debate. And it'll take work, it'll take discipline, and it'll take effort. Before we proceed on to talk a little bit about getting some help and assistance for this work, I want you to think about your own negotiations, a recent one, and just think about what could have been done to make it from complex to simple, to separate fact and meaning. And just take a moment to ask yourself how might what I have just suggested as 8 steps have helped in that negotiation. And then after we're finished the presentation here, I'm going to let everybody have a chance to ask questions or make comments about their own efforts in this regard. We are, as human beings, inevitably going to always be in negotiation. Our futures are literally created by conversation with others. We're finding that now with COVID as this tool we're using right now is a new way in which we create our futures together through Zoom. Isn't that interesting? So let's talk, though, a little bit about getting some help. So the first thing, of course, is that you don't have to be doing this on your own. You have family and friends, and they may help you. But remember, you want them to help you do the separation of fact, do the analysis, the objective analysis of your own role in the conflict. Perhaps if they know the other party, they can help you with your assumptions about that other party. But you don't want to just enroll them in your story. That's not helpful. You want them helping you create that potential for the future. If you have professional advisors, estate planners, financial planners, accountants, lawyers, who work with you, they're likely to be focused on trying to help you solve things as opposed to justifying being right about the trap you found yourself in. So you can certainly reach out to them. And then there is a cadre of professionals who can be helpful, and that's for the recent times the conflict management coach role, and that's a role where you've hired someone to enhance your conflict capacity, to help you with the way you communicate more effectively, to help you simplify conflict, much as we have just discussed, and to work together to help you prepare for effective negotiations, or help you prepare to manage conflict more effectively. Mediators, of course, are neutral third parties who step into the middle of the story and really, in its simplest sense, work the resolution formula. I think as a mediator, what I'm doing when I'm working with parties, even multiple parties, is really to support them to share their stories for understanding, for what they made it mean and what the other side made it mean. And then to help them shift the focus from that past and stuck to the future and what to do about it together in an effective conversation. So mediators are helping people have the quality of conversation that is necessary for them to reach a good solution that works for everyone. Shifting from positions to interests is what mediators say they're doing. And then very importantly, the lawyers and lots of conflict are going to need legal advice, both from the perspective of figuring out how to prove and establish the facts, and particularly if the other side is thought to be disingenuous or lying or whatever. So sometimes you are going to need lawyers to unpack your story with you. But I think you want to engage with lawyers who are what I call dual track. They're very skilled. They can be the gunfighter that you need if, in fact, this has to remain a battle. But they can also look for and be effective in opportunities for negotiations and for resolution. And so that's my thoughts about getting professional help. And basically, that's what I've wanted to share with you. I would have preferred that we were all in a room together and we could have a conversation about it, and I could pull from you the examples that make the case for keeping your conflicts as simple as possible. However, I might invite you now to unmute, and I think the system should let me see your hand put up if you want to speak, and I'll certainly try and answer your questions for the next few minutes. Or you can just raise your hand and I'll unmute you. Except that I can't see everybody. Does anybody have anything they want to comment on?
Dave, it's Dave Kitchen. I think I can unmute myself. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm able to unmute myself. So as you know, I act as I'm a lawyer, but I also act as a mediator. And you and I have chatted in the past about the language that's used, and you went through some of it in your slide presentation. And it's something I use now all the time in mediations, talking about, I think, as you indicated, putting the past in the rearview mirror and let's look forward. And just using that language with clients and counsel really seems to help them reframe the mediation process. Because when you approach a mediation, everyone is buried in the past. This is conflict, conflict, conflict. They're wanting to move forward. It takes a mediator sometimes to help them move forward. But it can be as simple as the language that you've just expressed in a simple way that allows people to see, right, I got to package that up and leave it behind so that the focus is on what I want to do with this and what I'm going to do moving forward. So it comes across as maybe simple, but it is incredibly effective language to use as a mediator. So I just wanted to put that out there because I use it in almost every mediation that I do.
Thanks, David. Certainly, all the solutions exist in the future, and so getting people to make that shift is critical. And as mediators, and even as lawyers, we observe when someone shifts. We know when someone has shifted back into their story because they're talking about the past. And so we have to go back and get them and remind them about the future and what's possible and get them to re-engage in building that future as opposed to staying stuck in the past. So thanks for your comments. Anybody else? You can unmute yourself and just speak. Yes, Chris.
There, I've unmuted myself. Dave, thanks for this. This has been very interesting. I found of the 8 steps, the process of number 3 of separating the facts and the meanings to be certainly important. I think it's done more often than number 4, or in way more depth than number 4 in my experiences, where people will gloss over the other party's side. So spending more time, I think, in building their defense than building their understanding. And I think that that's a great step then to accentuate in preparation, and then certainly as part of the mediation process, but really trying to, at the end of the day, asking the other parties their facts and their understanding of the meaning of the facts, so that there's more of an understanding. So I thought that was a great point, and maybe a stronger to work on the number 3 of the 3 and 4.
Both are necessary, Chris, because it's having both in front of one that allows for that analysis that leads to a more effective negotiation. Stephen Covey said it very well. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. And I think that's what's true there, both about your own story, because we get locked into, we get blind to our own story. So both 3 and 4 are necessary. But you're right, the one that gets the least attention is probably the other side, because we have a story about how unreasonable they have been and they will continue to be. We tell ourselves, hell, I already heard everything that Joe has to say, and I don't agree with it. He's wrong. And if he would only listen to me, he'd understand why I'm right, and this problem would all be solved. Not a very useful mindset, and 3 and 4 are designed to break that impasse. Anybody else?
Morning, David. It's Chuck Sanders. Thanks for putting this webinar on. Very good.
Thanks, Chuck.
Dave, I have a question in terms of getting the other party to the table.
Yes.
Oftentimes taking a collaborative approach, which I like that to me just seems logical and much easier than conflict. Sure. However, that olive branch that you stick out to the other side and say, hey, why don't we look at this together? That's oftentimes seen as a form of weakness in the negotiation. Yeah. How do you combat that perception? Maintain the fact that you're strong and confident, but you're willing to have a dialogue. What in your experience has worked in that regard?
Basically, being explicit about what you just said. The weakness mindset is just a story you tell yourself. If I do this way, I might appear to be weak. And so it seems to me logical that you simply start off your invite to say, I think we can solve this. I want to have a conversation. I don't want you to think that I'm being weak here. I've done some homework, and here's what I've done to try and prepare for this. And I'm prepared to be tough as hell on the problem, but I think that if you and I can work a bit collaboratively here, we can solve this. So you make explicit that this isn't about weak or strong. It's about finding a solution that works for both sides. If your counterpart chuckles and makes that still that you're being weak, then you stop and you go and find somebody like Jim Bancroft or whomever, or Dave Kitchen, who can begin the conversations through the legal system. That's why the courts are never going to close. Some people won't play, but I think that if you push the envelope of collaboration in an effective way, you can get a lot more people to the table than we often think we can.
Yeah, and I guess just to add to that comment, with all respect to the court system and so on, I mean, it's the worst place to solve your problems. And literally, I mean, years and years and years of litigation. The system is so backlogged and behind it, there's no timeliness there at all. So, I'd even question whether that really is a viable option in most cases. I just don't think it is, in my experience.
No, and I think that's going to get worse as we go forward. The courts have certainly been down long enough that there's a huge backlog of cases that are ready to settle that aren't settling, and it'll take a long time to catch up. And the question, of course, is the COVID is having a huge impact on our financial realities. So the question becomes, how many people can afford access to that kind of justice? I'm not sure very many can, and I think a lot of the claims for damages are going to fall on the reality that the company that might have done us harm is now bankrupt and can't afford to compensate us anyway. So the litigation system's not going to be a very useful tool for a period of time. Necessary perhaps, but not very useful.
David, it's Dave Kitchen again. I just want to pick up on something that Chuck had said in terms of the perception of weakness of the other side. And I fully agree with your comments, just be explicit and forthright. But I also think, this is maybe more of the litigator and less of the mediator talking. I also think, so what? If you on the other side have a misperception as to what my intentions are, that's fine. You're coming in, then I'm coming in on an upper hand to the negotiation because I know what my true intentions are and what my objectives are. And so if you've misconceived those, that's fine. We'll clarify it. But I sometimes, as a litigator, will use that as an advantage going into negotiations. So it can be seen two ways, I guess.
Thanks, David.
Hi, it's Kirsty. I just wanted to say thank you as well, David. Great presentation. And just to add to what David and Chuck just said, yes, I'm not a lawyer, but as a mediator or even just as a negotiator, again, I think who cares what the other side says? Actually, if they think that you're weaker, you do have the advantage. And it's just how you tailor your approach. And to collaborate, I mean, you're going to get more information that way anyhow. A little bit of information, in the very least, is better than none at all.
Thanks, Christy. I think too that if we think about what's going to occur in the meeting itself, where if you followed my guide and you have shared with the other party who thinks that you might be being weak, that you have worked to separate the facts from the meanings, and you in that conversation focus on the facts that are in conflict and talk about ways in which to determine those facts going forward, including the risk of litigation in the future and the cost and the impact of it. You literally have shifted the conversation to a much safer environment emotionally, because the facts are determinable and the facts are not the meaning. And so that separation in your conversations takes the whole question of who's harder nosed, who's stronger, who's weaker, and turns it on its head, because you're talking about practical things that need to be solved no matter what, in the form of the facts and the disputes about the facts. So when you've done this preparation, you simply have a mosaic of potential conversations that can shift. And keep in mind, your resolution formula at play is, I want this conversation to work to shift. If it's Chris I'm having the battle with, I want to shift Chris's focus from the story of what I did 3 years ago that has him pissed off today to what are we going to do about it going forward based on these facts, or based on the shared view that we're now trying to create. So I think it largely takes the whole question of hard-nosed bargaining and turns it on its head.
Trust building.
Sorry, anybody else? Thoughts, comments?
It's Chuck Sanders again. Hey, is there, in terms of reading material, books and stuff that you might recommend, what's your reading list look like?
Oh, Chuck, it's extensive. Some of it is not making conflict simple. Quite the contrary, it makes it complex. But it's good reading, and I will send you a few titles to have a quick look at. The sort of the seminal piece um, is Roger Fisher's book. What's the name of it? I keep forgetting. The original one, Dave.
Get past no.
Yeah, Getting to Yes. Sorry, thank you, Alex. My
Read it, yeah.
tech guru. Getting to Yes and Getting Past No, and I was blessed to be able to work with the Harvard Negotiation Institute a few years back, in looking at bringing these kinds of conversations more broadly to the world, because Eric Ario Fox, who was a protege of Roger Fisher, had been driving across the bridge into New York City when the planes went into the tower. And she was Jewish, and she concluded that the ways in which we were having conversations about conflict in the world wasn't working. That was an obvious example. And she wanted to shift the work of Roger Fisher and Bill Urey from Harvard to the world at large. And so she had me chair something she called the Global Negotiation Insight Initiative. And I remain dismayed as I watched the news today that I'm not sure we've learned a whole bunch from it, but I guess we have to remain optimistic.
I have a sort of a question here, David, and also thank you for putting this on. This is a great presentation. In my experience, I work in oil and gas and in a management role. Often some of the issues or bones of contention with, say, a landowner are years old, often predating my involvement or even employment in the organization. Of course, there's records kept on the interactions with these people, but they are, I'm assuming, and by observation, thinking that they're really forms of story from the others who have taken part in trying to resolve these things. So I guess if I have a question is how might you unravel the story from the fact when numerous people who have been involved in this scenario may not be at the company anymore, and you're just the next person who's trying to resolve this thing?
It's a great question, Mark, because what I think I'll interpret what you just asked is that you've got people who are stuck in story that is ancient enough that you have no direct involvement with it or ability to engage with it as if you had been there. And so the question becomes, what do you do about it? And I think the first thing is that you listen and you reflect for them. I hear that happened. I hear that my counterpart of that era said this and did this, and that had this impact on you, and what you made it mean is this. And so until you are satisfied, and more to the point, they are satisfied that you actually understand how they see the past. And then you do the invite to talk about what are we going to do about it, because we are here circa today's date, and I want to work with you to create a future that works for both of us. The oil industry has had a tremendous challenge in the recent years from people simply buying into the environmental message, and I'm not judging it at all, but I'm just saying that right now they don't want to create a future with you, and that becomes the most important challenge that you face, is that they are unwilling to dialogue about you still being there. They just want you gone, and unfortunately that's not negotiable. So God bless the governments for figuring out how to deal with that, whether it's First Nations that are standing on a railroad line and blocking access. So we have lots of very complex conflicts coming at us. But to make any conflict simple, you have to really have the other party feel that they have been heard and that they are understood. And then based on that understanding, they become willing, hopefully with my resolution formula, to have a conversation about what's possible in the future that meets both their needs and your needs. Hope that helped.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. And I think maybe just to add to that is the factor of gaining trust again is probably a little more difficult because, you know, if you're the third person that they've sat with over the years, I'm sure the company message has always been, I'm the guy who's trying to resolve this. And
Sure.
they're sitting there going, yeah, right. You know,
Yeah.
so you have to find a quick way to build trust and then start working together from there.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm not entirely sure there is a quick way. I think it just involves lots of listening and engagement and making good on what promises you can actually affect. So like any relationship, trust occurs over time. And if it's not there now, then you want to create it in the future. And that becomes part of that plan you work to collaborate on to build that trust.
Great. Thank you.
So my system here still says there's a bunch of people still listening. If any of you have comments, we've got a couple more minutes and then I'll let you all go. Also, I think you all have my email now, or you have access to my website. If you send me something via LinkedIn or Facebook or by email with questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I'll also be turning this into, it's being taped, and so you can get it through my website and re-listen to it or send it to someone who you think, maybe you've got someone you want to have a difficult negotiation with, and you say to them, hey, I just listened to this Google character and he said some sensible things. I'm going to send you his preparation to get ahead and stay at a conflict. Why don't you listen to it and then we'll have a more effective conversation. Not sure that'll work, but what the hell. Nothing from anybody else? All right. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and have a great day and stay safe, everybody.